Hey, Goldy, did you see the video this week of Jon Stewart interviewing Larry Summers?
I heard about it, but I couldn't take the time to watch it because, unlike Larry, I'm too busy working with Nick trying to make the economy work better for all Americans instead of just the super rich.
Well, let me tell you, it's everywhere. We should watch it. Let's turn it on. Here we go.
Okay.
What basically happened to us as we had massive stimulus and an economy that could only produce so much. We had huge levels of demand, and those huge levels of demand kept pushing up prices and pushing up wages. But ultimately, it was you put too much water in the bathtub overflows. You put too much demand into the economy, and you get high and rising prices.
But the San Francisco Fed says that demand is maybe 30 to 35% of the inflation. Wages are really around 20% of the inflation. There's a huge corporate profit aspect to it. There's a huge supply chain aspect to it. But our method for controlling it seems really much more focused on wages and employment.
There's certain sicknesses you can have where there's a drug.
Here we go.
And it has side effects. And everybody hates the side effects, and no doctor wants their patient to suffer the side effects. But if you don't address
So the side
sickness-
effect Summers is talking about is mass suffering.
Yeah,
As
so
far
let's
as I
take a
can
bit-
tell.
Yeah, well, hold on, Goldie. So just for everybody's benefit out there, let's talk a little bit about what he means that we're filling the bucket first and foremost.
Uh-huh.
Because
Bathtub.
this really
Come
gets. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
You don't
It's
want
the
to
bathtub.
misrepresent him. You know, filling the bathtub, that's the thing that you drown government in, remember.
Right. So, hey, listen, everybody. What do we even care about what Larry Summers thinks? Who the heck is this guy, and why do we care? Let's give a little background, because my guess is a lot of people don't even know. Hey, Goldie, who the heck is Larry Summers? Who is
Former
this guy?
president of Harvard, former secretary of the Treasury under Bill Clinton, he was the head of the National Economic Council. Is that right? In the Obama administration. So a very serious person who is accustomed to being taken very seriously.
Yeah, and so
Which
here's the deal
raises
Go ahead.
the question why he sat down with Jon Stewart.
Here's the deal. Larry Summers is one of the most consequential people when it comes to economic policy, really, of the last, what would you say, Gold, 25, 30 years? It's a really long career.
As long as you don't count the past year. I think he's
And
not
his-
taking it seriously.
He's taken a lot less seriously now. And part of the reason is he has been one of the chief advocates for neoliberal policies, trickle-down economics. And if you have had complaints about what the economy has been doing, it is likely that he was there helping make those policies, particularly in the aftermath of the Great Recession.
Right. To be clear, neoliberal in the Democratic Party version of it. That he is like he's a Democrat, right? He is the Democrats' neoliberal.
That's right. So here's the deal. He's sitting down here with Jon. Jon is talking to him about inflation. Larry has been running around the whole country, particularly Bloomberg News and Twitter, talking about all the dumb things we did in reaction to COVID. And what he really is saying is we filled the bathtub too much, which I think is really interesting. He's got this, frankly, mechanistic understanding of how the economy works. Goldie, do you want to unpack this idea that underlies this neoliberal perception of the economy? What goes up must go down. There's kind of these limits to what's going to happen.
Yeah. So fundamentally, the economics, the neoclassical economics at the heart of Larry Summers' world vision, and really that has dominated economics for the past half century, is that it's an equilibrium system, right? That it all balances out in the end. So that's the whole thing about supply and demand. The classic example, the example they use at Harvard, where he was president, in Econ 10, Principles of Economics, Mankiw's widely used textbook, when they illustrate price curves, supply and demand, they use the minimum wage as an example. And what the textbook says is that if you raise the minimum wage, if you raise it above, what the natural market rate was, the clearing price, jobs will go down. Not they may go down, they might go down. They will go down. They have to. That's the thing with supply and demand. So what Larry Summers is saying is that during COVID, we gave people money so that they wouldn't starve or become homeless. And that filled the economy with all this demand. And demand is outstripping supply. And so prices are going to go up until supply and demand balance out, because that's an equilibrium system. It always mechanistically works that way.
And so the medicine he wants to do here, Goldy, what does he want to do to help reset?
He wants to reduce demand by putting people out of work so that they don't have income. Yeah. This is what Paul Volcker did in the early 80s to break that inflationary cycle of the 70s. He jacked up interest rates to make it too expensive for American companies to invest in creating jobs and maintaining factories, creating unemployment above 10%. What, 12% unemployment? Yeah. He jacked up interest rates. I remember you could get like 16, 17% on a CD back then. My student loans were 11%, some of them, in the early 80s. And it worked. We had this horrible, horrible, miserable recession that middle-class America has never recovered from, but inflation was relatively low for a couple decades.
Yeah. So here's the thing. Part of what Jon is pushing back on is even the Fed has said that Larry's premise that we put too much demand in the system by giving regular people money is actually not that responsible for what's going on with inflation. Let's listen to a little bit more of this, because it's really interesting as Jon pokes at some of his assumptions. All right, let's pop this on.
We're going to have a bigger problem down the road.
But the stock market assets have gone up 150%. CEO pay has gone up 1,500%. Workers' wages haven't gone up at all. I think you're misdiagnosing the sickness.
First, Jon, inequality is a terrible thing. The most serious problem.
Is that the least sincere that you've ever heard anybody address?
Between those like you and me, who are very fortunate. That's why we need a strategy of strengthening labor power in the economy. The question, though, is it an issue that somebody whose control is over setting interest rates and printing money can do much about? Now, you could say that they shouldn't have responded to the 2009 recession by cutting money, by cutting interest rates. You could say that.
Yes,
but
you could.
Do you really think, and certainly that wasn't what progressives were saying at that time.
It doesn't matter.
At that time, progressives were saying we need lower interest rates so people can borrow money to buy houses and put people to work.
But they were stimulating it
for car
at
loans.
the corporate level, where they just put the money in the hands of the bankers and say, you decide. This pandemic was the first time the government, in my opinion, did the thing that they're supposed to do in a crisis.
Good job, Jon.
When you look at the stimulus payments that went out, 70% of it was being used for rent and food. And if you look at the recovery in the pandemic versus the recovery from 2008, when you stimulated the economy at the demand level, jobs had plunged in the pandemic, and then they shot back up. The recovery in 2009 was painstaking, but the stock market did great. So our fiscal policy and our monetary policy has always been on the side of corporate easing.
Just so we're clear, if you talk to African-American voters, if you talk to Hispanic voters, talk to voters who don't have college degrees, they regard the country's biggest problem as having to do with inflation.
So I would be clear here. So Larry Summers is claiming he's the voice of...
I think that's where he was getting to. Hey, he's ready to talk about the average African-American and Latino voter and what they're thinking. Hey, Goldy, John sounds a lot like you here. I don't mean to pay him an insult and you a compliment, but he actually sounds like a lot. Let's talk about how in that Great Recession, what John is not saying, of course, is that Larry Summers himself had a lot to do with our response to the Great Recession. Right. As a reminder, Larry was there making policy decisions with Barack Obama and that team. If you think that we had low growth, high unemployment, and no wage growth in the era after 2008 under the Obama years, by the way, those are all factually true. It's because of Larry Summers. And we had a different reaction to this last crisis.
Right. So there's a couple things here. And one of the things that John points out is there's one type of inflation that people like Larry have no problem with, and that is asset price inflation. So the stock market did great post 2009. That was a very rapid and steep recovery. And it went on right up until the pandemic, and then crashed, and then really did great during the pandemic. Okay. So the stock market recovered very quickly. Larry Summers was very pleased with that. When you're talking about the responses that were largely a part of Larry's influence, we're talking about two things. One is what the Fed did, which was flood the market with liquidity, which of course created all that asset inflation, because the people that got the liquidity were corporations and really rich people. And what did they do? They put it into assets like stocks and bonds and real estate, and those things went through the roof.
And don't forget yachts, Goldy, yachts.
Yes, yachts, private jets. Those aren't really assets. Those are that's consumption. That's not an asset, right? So I'm not going to make that mistake. The other thing they did, and this was also very big with Summers' influences, they were very worried about budget deficits, about the government spending too much.
Oh, my goodness.
So one of the things that happened post-Great Recession is that we had a natural experiment going on worldwide. In Europe, in the European Union, you had austerity, and they had a terrible time recovering from the Great Recession. Very painful, very slow, lots of collapses throughout Europe. Remember the whole Euro crisis, okay? So they were on the deep austerity side. On the other side of it was China, which said, oh, we read all the books about the Great Depression. And so they didn't just flood their markets with money. They went and they spent a shit ton. That, one of the reasons why they built all those power plants and all those roads and airports and high-speed rail, they were building it after the Great Recession because they needed to spend money to put people to work. And they actually, slow growth for China in that 5-6% GDP, but they managed to get back up to a GDP growth rate that would be enviable in good times. And then the US was somewhere in the middle. Early on, we did stimulus. We ran up those deficits. We cut taxes and we spent money, but it was not enough, and we knew it wasn't enough. And or I should say, a lot of people thought it wasn't enough. But Summers and his camp was arguing, no, you don't want to do too much. And so we ended up with a decade of slow economic growth, very slow job growth. It took a decade for unemployment rates to fall back to a more normal level. At the same time, stock market went through the roof.
Yeah. And this is why we had, among many reasons, Larry Summers has been there when we've had ballooning inequality in this country.
Right.
Because he is intentionally, through policy, holding wages down and letting assets skyrocket, which is what John's getting to here. Let's hear a little bit more.
Right.
Go ahead. All right, here we go.
You may see this as having been tremendously successful. Our fellow Americans who don't live as comfortably as you and I do have a lot of questions, John, about what's happened. And it's not hard to understand why they have a lot of questions in light of what's happened
Right.
to their purchasing power.
But you're suggesting their
because we took
purchasing
a good
power-
idea and overdid it.
I disagree.
By providing
I just
for
disagree.
too much
So here's-
inflation.
But what you're not addressing is not all of inflation was stimulus. The tools that we have, though, are basically saying to somebody, everyone's paying more for gas and groceries, and that's really hard. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to throw 10 million of them out of work so
Get
that
'em,
we
John.
all don't have to share that burden. Why aren't we attacking corporate profit in any way? Because that's been estimated to be 30% of inflation, 40% of inflation.
I don't think it's a tenable view that all of a sudden corporations became greedy. Of course, there's monopolies in the economy, John, and we should be for
They've been
much
bragging
more
about it
aggressive,
on
much more
their earnings
aggressive
calls.
than we were.
They're on their earnings calls, they're saying our profits have never been higher. We're killing it. The markups during the pandemic are sometimes they're saying 70% of what they were.
If there was a huge increase in the demand for shrewd television commentary, I imagine the demand for what you do would go way up. And I imagine you'd convert that into higher wages and getting more and getting paid better.
You're
And
saying
I don't
it's the
think
market
you'd
at
call
work.
I don't think you'd call yourself a gouger when you.
I would absolutely
when-
call myself
when you do
that.
that.
And by the way,
When
the
there's a-
effect of the talk show business is very different than the effect of ExxonMobil,
Yeah.
right? I mean, let's be fair.
Oh, Larry's not so sure about
Going to
that.
be on Apple TV.
Correct.
Oh, wait a minute, wait a minute. This is really important. Hey,
worth
everybody.
About 5 times as much as Exxon. I think Apple's price since the stimulus began,
Now, Larry
Apple's
thinks he's got
value has
him.
gone up by about 1.2 trillion
Yeah,
dollars.
John's
Right.
gonna
That's
agree.
$4,000 for every American. Just an increase in the value of
You
Apple.
just made my
Do you-
point for me.
Do you feel that Apple is somehow gouging or doing something wrong?
Yes, of course. And Exxon is. and
Look.
Let's talk about Apple. Let's talk about Apple. Do you?
I just want to point out,
Yeah,
like,
isn't this
he
just
does
the
know
list?
he does know who Jon Stewart is, right?
I don't know.
It's not like Borat.
I don't know. I think he thought he had him. John is a big.
Oh yeah, no, you're never going to say something bad about your employer.
Oh, well, yeah. Let's finish this part up. This is quite. This
Okay.
is really.
Apple should just sell phones for less and not have enough phones. What would you have Apple do?
You're saying to me, John, market forces are market forces. And if demand goes up, are you suggesting, young man, that Apple should charge less than they could charge? Let me flip that on you. When there's a tightness in the labor market, what you're saying is the workers shouldn't do the same. That the workers, just following the same capitalistic principles that allow Apple to charge more for their phones, shouldn't charge more because wage inflation is driving inflation.
That's not at all what I'm saying, John.
That's exactly what you're
no,
saying.
That's
actually,
what he's
there's-
saying. I think that's what he's
Every
saying.
worker should get as high a wage as they can. It would be a terrible idea.
But the
to try to
Fed is
restrict
going to
the wages.
intervene. The
When-
Fed is going
no.
to intervene to make that not possible.
No, the Fed is intervening to control the overall level of demand growth.
And what will
Because
that
if it
do to
goes-
and what will that do to
because
the
if it
labor market?
goes much faster
What will that do
than
to the labor
supply,
market? What
it
will it
lead
do to the
to-
labor market?
This is the question, John.
It will
It is
loosen it
likely to lead
to looser labor markets.
a somewhat looser labor market.
Exactly.
We hope to minimize that consequence.
Oh, there we go,
Okay.
Goldy.
Good place to stop here, because let's get to a fundamental model of economics.
Yeah.
Okay. The reason why the Fed is raising interest rates is that there is presumed to be an inverse relationship between interest rates and employment. Okay. So when you raise interest rates, unemployment will go up. If you lower interest rates, employment will go down, right? It's got to do with the idea being that companies are going to invest. They look at inflation and unemployment as being two things they try to balance. And when inflation gets too high, they go and they lower employment. They increase unemployment to try to bring inflation down. Essentially, the Fed only has two tools. It can create liquidity. It can essentially create money by buying assets and flooding the market with liquidity. That is what it did after the Great Recession. That is what it did during COVID to try to prevent a crash. It creates trillions of quantitative easing. The other thing it can do is control interest rates. Those are really the only two tools it has. And I think one of the things that we're getting to, and I think Jon must be getting at, I haven't seen the whole video, is that we've already talked about this, the flooding the market with liquidity, that creates asset inflation. Much of that just goes to the rich. And they weren't investing it, they were hoarding it. We know that. The Federal Reserve has said that people were hoarding cash. When it gets to interest rates, there's a strong argument to make that worked in the early 80s. Volcker, who was lionized for creating all that pain and suffering to tame inflation, Fed chairs have been trying to follow Volcker's example ever since. The problem is, this isn't that economy.
No.
It's a very different economy. Our inflation has a very different cause. We are not in this psychological cycle of expectations. When you look at the surveys, people don't expect inflation to be high a couple of years from now. We're not in a cycle where people are spending all their money now because they know it'll buy less tomorrow. That's not what's causing inflation. It is largely, disproportionately, a supply chain crisis. It is a supply chain crisis created from the disruption of the COVID shutdowns. We shut down the global economy. I
want to point out, Goldy, we've never done that before.
Right. Never.
Ever in like world history.
All at once.
All at once.
All at once. And China has shut down China, who manufactures for the world, has multiple times shut down huge segments of their country, of their manufacturing set, because when they've had outbreaks of COVID, right? So that's one thing. We did this thing that has never happened before. Obviously, it's hard to start it back up again. So that's part of it. The other thing is, we have this war in Ukraine from being waged by one of the largest fossil fuel exporters in the world on a country that is one of the largest grain exporters in the world. And so you have disrupted the oil and gas industry to the point where people can't afford to heat their homes in Europe because natural gas prices are so high. And we've disrupted the whole global food system, where if we don't get that grain shipped around the world, millions of people starve. Yeah. So,
and on top of all of that, Goldy, go ahead. COVID shutdown and disrupts supply chains.
And then a third thing that's happening, climate change. It's real. It's happening. It's happened throughout the world. It has been creating droughts and floods. Big thing this winter where in the UK, because of Brexit and because of some bad weather from some of their suppliers, you can't buy fresh fruits and vegetables in the UK. You can't make a salad. You can't get lettuce in London.
And then,
I'm sure the rich can.
And then, as Jon points out, corporations took advantage of exactly the circumstances you outline here, and they literally brag about it on their earnings calls that they are able to charge people enormous sums of money.
Larry was right about one thing when he said they didn't suddenly become greedy. They just took advantage of the opportunity, right? Yeah. They've always been greedy. That's... because another thing of the neoliberal era, the shareholder value maximization theorem, the the Friedman doctrine, which is the sole purpose, the one and only purpose of the corporation is to increase profits for shareholders.
Yeah. And I just want to point out one final thing on this question that Larry ignores, and I wish John would have got into. He implies that this massive amount of water we put into the bathtub that has to go somewhere, as if that is the thing that was causing inflation, when we had simultaneous experiments in how to react to COVID running all over the world. Different countries did different things. You know what everybody has in common? High inflation. Everybody went about this differently. They approached it differently. Some places, like the United States, we did cut a lot of checks. We put a lot of people money in people's pockets. We were worried about people starving or being thrown out of their homes because we were shutting down the economy. Some places, they kept them attached to their workplace. They allowed them to continue to receive a paycheck at a workplace, but they did not get extra money. Some places gave people direct food aid. They didn't give them more money to buy food. They gave them direct food aid. Different things were working in different places. Japan and South Korea handled it differently than New Zealand. New Zealand handled it differently than the UK, differently than France. But you know what we all have in common is high inflation. It certainly suggests that something else is going on.
That it wasn't just the U.S. And I want to be clear about one other thing about what Larry's claim is that we shouldn't have done it. We did too much, right? We shouldn't have sent so much money to people during COVID because, look, we ended up with inflation. You know what else we ended up with? People not starving. Now we're starting to see the line. Now that all these payments have ended, we're starting to see the lines at the food banks again. We're now faced with millions of people losing the extra Medicaid that came during COVID. So now people are starting to lose their health care again. But during COVID, we took care of people so that they didn't starve.
Yeah. He would rather, as you know, he would rather have 10% unemployment and 2% inflation than vice versa. And it tells you a lot about his mentality, because that 2% inflation really ultimately is going to be, what we know is the only way he can get there, he can imagine getting there, is to drive unemployment through the roof, which ultimately is what we did in the Great Recession. And as you pointed out, his hero, Volcker, did in the late 70s and early 80s. Yeah. All right. Well, everybody, go check out the whole thing. God bless Jon Stewart for doing it. That's who Larry Summers is. Keep an eye on him. You'll see him a lot. Don't believe him. He's wrong about the economy. Let's we'll come back to this another time, Goldy.
Happy to. If you can, and anytime I get to hear Jon Stewart take apart a neoliberal economist, it's a good day.